I never imagined my end would come like this. The wedding hall was decorated beautifully, golden chandeliers casting a warm glow, elegant floral arrangements filling the air with their delicate scent. But all of it was a cruel illusion, because this wasn't my wedding. This was hers. The girl my family had taken in as an orphan. My adopted sister. The girl I had loved, protected, and trusted more than anyone. And the man waiting at the altar was my fiancé. I stood in the shadows watching as they exchanged vows, my body trembling with disbelief. "Do you, Nathan, take her as your wife?" My fiancé, no, my former fiancé, smiled down at her. The same smile he used to give me. "I do." I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palm. I was supposed to be standing there. My sister, dressed in white, stole everything from me. And she wasn't even ashamed of it. She turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting mine. Then she smiled. Not with guilt. Not with regret. With satisfaction. And in that moment I knew this was never an accident. She had planned it. I stumbled backward, my breathing uneven, my chest tightening. How had this happened? Had I been so blind? Every memory of her came rushing back. Her soft voice, her sweet words, her gentle tears. It was all an act. She had been waiting for the right moment. To take my place. And I had let her. As I turned to leave, my vision blurred. Dizziness overtook me. Something was wrong. My limbs felt weak, my breath shallow. Like the air itself was turning against me. Poison. A sudden realization hit me like a storm. This wasn't just betrayal. This was murder. And as the world faded around me, I heard their voices. Whispering. Laughing. She was too naive. Now, everything that was hers belongs to me. My sister's voice. Sweet. Fake. It's better this way. And then darkness. I gasped for air. But instead of death, I woke up somewhere else. Somewhere familiar. A soft bed. Warm morning light. The scent of fresh linen. I sat up, my heart pounding. My hands small again. My body young. Alive. My eyes darted to the calendar on the desk. The date years before my death. Right before the day she was adopted. A slow, eerie smile spread across my lips. This time I won't let you take anything from me. I sat in my childhood bedroom, my fingers gripping the sheets as I struggled to breathe. It was real. I was alive. Not in that cursed wedding hall. Not lying cold in the shadows, discarded like a broken toy. I had returned. But why? Was it fate? Revenge? A cruel second chance? None of it mattered. Because this time I wouldn't be the fool. This time I would take everything before she could. A knock at the door. My heart clenched as my mother's voice rang out. "Sweetheart, come downstairs. We have a surprise for you." I already knew what it was. I glanced at the calendar again. The day she was adopted. The day everything started falling apart. I took a slow, steady breath and stood. Let's see who the real actress is now. I walked down the stairs, my mother standing at the entrance beaming. Beside her, holding onto her arm with shy innocence, was her. The girl who would one day take everything from me. Small. Frail-looking. Her eyes wide and teary, her lips trembling. She played the part of the scared orphan so well. I used to fall for this. Not this time. My mother touched my shoulder gently. "This is your new sister. Be kind to her, all right?" I turned my gaze to the little girl, watching as she peeked up at me beneath her lashes. She was already testing me. Already trying to gauge my weakness. So I smiled. Soft. Sweet. Fake. I bent down slightly, holding out my hand. "Welcome home, sister." Her fingers trembled before she placed them in mine. But I could feel it, the hesitation. She knew something was different this time. Good. She should be scared. For the next few days, I played my part flawlessly. I was kind. I was gentle. I let her think I was still the naive, loving sister she had so easily manipulated before. But behind my smiles, I was planning her downfall. Watching her carefully. Testing her reactions. Because I knew she wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She had always been calculating. Always waiting for the right moment to strike. And now? I was waiting to. The first time I caught her lying, I didn't expose her. She had taken a small necklace from my jewelry box, stuffing it into her pocket when she thought I wasn't looking. I had ignored this in my past life. I had let her get away with small things. But those small things had led to bigger betrayals. I walked past her slowly, stopping just beside her. Then in the softest, sweetest voice I whispered, "You should return that before someone notices." She stiffened immediately. Her fingers tightened around the stolen necklace. Slowly she turned her head, her wide, innocent eyes meeting mine. She knew. She knew I had caught her. But more than that, she knew I wasn't the same fool I had been before. She hesitated, then pulled the necklace out, placing it back in the box without a word. I didn't scold her. I didn't tattle. I just smiled, like I hadn't already decided to destroy her. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt something I hadn't felt in my past life. Control. This time I wasn't waiting for her betrayal. I was getting ahead of it. And tomorrow I would set my first real trap. I woke up before dawn, the house still silent, untouched by the morning sun. I wasn't the same girl as before. In my past life, I had spent years protecting her, believing her lies, watching as she slowly stole everything that belonged to me. This time, I was going to take everything first. And my first move? Making sure my parents never trusted her. At breakfast, I sat quietly, watching my mother and father exchange small talk. They still believed in their perfect family. They didn't realize that I was about to destroy the daughter they chose over me. I smiled at my sister. She smiled back. But I saw it now. The way her fingers twitched slightly around her spoon. The way her eyes flickered toward me, cautious. She knew. She knew I wasn't the same fool anymore. And that was exactly what I wanted.
I started small.
A misplaced item. A forgotten task. Nothing too obvious, just enough to make her look careless. Unreliable. Like yesterday. I had already caught her stealing. Now it was time to make sure our parents saw it too. It was too easy. I accidentally left one of my favorite books on the table, right where she could see it. She hesitated before picking it up, running her fingers over the cover. Then she slowly tucked it into her school bag. I almost laughed. Some habits never change. But instead of confronting her, I did something better. I waited. At dinner that night, I kept my voice soft, my tone hesitant. "Mom, have you seen my book? The one Grandma gave me." My mother frowned. "No, dear. Where did you leave it?" "I don't remember," I said, shaking my head. "I had it this morning." My sister froze. I could feel her panic from across the table. And then, just as expected, my mother turned to her. "Sweetie, have you seen your sister's book?" My sister swallowed hard. I waited for her lie. I don't know," she mumbled. I let a pause settle in before my eyes widened. "Wait, didn't I see you looking at it earlier?" Silence. Her shoulders tensed. My father frowned. "Is that true?" She hesitated for too long. And just like that, the first seed of doubt was planted. She returned the book that night. Silently. No excuses. No explanations. She simply placed it back on my desk and walked away. I smirked. She was starting to realize. She had spent years taking things from me, framing me, twisting stories. But this time, I was ahead of her. The next day I struck again. This time, I left one of my mother's expensive bracelets in the hallway. And just like before, she took it. But this time, I made sure the housemaid saw her. And when my mother found out, she didn't ask questions. She simply looked at my sister with disappointment. And disappointment was far worse than anger. I watched my sister that night, sitting in the dark of my bedroom, listening to her muffled sobs from down the hall. She knew what was happening. She knew that for the first time she was losing. And I had only just begun. I woke up to the sound of hushed whispers outside my bedroom door. My parents were talking low, serious. I didn't need to hear the words to know what it was about. They were disappointed in her. She had spent years playing the perfect daughter, the innocent victim, the sweet sister who could do no wrong. And now she was the problem. The one stealing, lying, making excuses. She wasn't trustworthy anymore. Just the way I wanted. At breakfast, my mother barely looked at her. My father didn't ask her about school. Didn't even acknowledge her presence. I watched her shift uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers clutching the fork tightly. She felt it. She felt the weight of being ignored. The same way I had felt it for years. But I wasn't done yet. Private punishment wasn't enough. She had humiliated me publicly in my past life. Now I was going to return the favor. That afternoon, I waited until we arrived at a family gathering. A party filled with distant relatives, family friends, and high-status guests. Everyone who mattered in our parents' world. The perfect place to ruin her. The moment came when my mother took me aside, her voice gentle. "Darling, I'm so proud of how responsible you've been lately." I tilted my head, letting my expression soften. "Thank you, Mom." She sighed. "I just wish your sister would follow your example." There it was. I kept my face neutral. "She's just going through a phase," I said lightly. "She probably doesn't mean any harm." But my mother didn't look convinced. "She used to be so well behaved," she muttered. "Now I don't know anymore." I almost laughed. The real attack came when my aunt, one of my mother's closest friends, brought up my sister in conversation. "She's a lucky girl," my aunt said. "Adopted into such a prestigious family." My mother stiffened. That's when I struck. I sighed dramatically, my voice just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Yes, we've had a few issues with her lately." Several heads turned. My aunt frowned. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, pretending to choose my words carefully. Then in the sweetest, most sympathetic tone I said, "She's been struggling with honesty." Gasps. Whispers. My mother froze. And my sister, who had been standing nearby, went pale. I watched her realization hit. This wasn't a private punishment anymore. This was public shame. Everything she had worked so hard to build. The trust, the fake innocence, the admiration was slipping through her fingers. I turned to her, pretending to be apologetic. "Sorry," I said softly. "Did I say too much?" Her hands shook with anger. I smiled. The damage was done. The rest of the evening, people whispered about her. Relatives eyed her cautiously, some even pulling their children closer. And my mother? She barely looked at her. She was ashamed. That night, my sister stormed into my room, slamming the door behind her. "You're doing this," she hissed. I stared at her innocently. "Doing what?" Her nostrils flared. "I know what you're doing." I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "I'm just being your caring older sister." She shook with fury. She knew, but she couldn't prove it. And that was the worst part for her. I leaned in, dropping my voice to a whisper. "This time, little sister, I won't be the one disappearing." Her face went white. For the first time, she was the one afraid. And I was just getting started. Fire cliffhanger for part 4. The protagonist publicly humiliates her sister, planting the idea in everyone's mind that she is not trustworthy. The sister realizes too late that she is losing control. Now she knows she is in danger. She didn't sleep that night. I could hear her pacing in her room, her footsteps uneven, her breath shallow with frustration. She had never experienced loss before. Never known what it was like to be the one looked down upon. For years, she had lived in my shadow, waiting for the right moment to push me out and take everything. Now I was the one pushing her. And she was slipping. At breakfast, she didn't eat. Her usual fake smile? Gone. Her usual sweet voice? Silent. My mother barely spoke to her. My father didn't even look at her. And when I casually asked, "Did you sleep well, little sister?" she snapped her spoon in half. I had already won. But she didn't know how to accept defeat. So I waited for her to make her final desperate move. And I didn't have to wait long. I leaned in, dropping my voice to a whisper. "This time, little sister, I won't be the one disappearing." Her face went white. For the first time, she was the one afraid. And I was just getting started. Now she knows she is in danger. She didn't sleep that night. I could hear her pacing in her room, her footsteps uneven, her breath shallow with frustration. She had never experienced loss before. Never known what it was like to be the one looked down upon. For years, she had lived in my shadow, waiting for the right moment to push me out and take everything. Now I was the one pushing her. And she was slipping. At breakfast, she didn't eat. Her usual fake smile? Gone. Her usual sweet voice? Silent. My mother barely spoke to her. My father didn't even look at her. And when I casually asked, "Did you sleep well, little sister?" she snapped her spoon in half. I had already won. But she didn't know how to accept defeat. So I waited for her to make her final desperate move. And I didn't have to wait long. That evening she came to my room. Her footsteps were soft, hesitant. Her hands trembled as she pushed the door open. She tried to smile, but her lips wavered. "Sister," she whispered, "can we talk?" I tilted my head, watching her closely. "Of course." She stepped inside, carefully closing the door behind her. Then she pulled a knife from her sleeve. Ah, there it is. Her final betrayal. The same way she had done it in my past life, when I had trusted her the most. But this time, I wasn't blind. I was waiting for her. She lunged. I moved first. Her wrist twisted under my grip, the knife clattering to the floor before she could even blink. Her eyes widened in shock horror. What?" she gasped. I tightened my hold, pushing her against the wall. She had expected the same weak sister from before. But I had been reborn. And this time I was stronger. Tears welled in her eyes. Fake just like always. "Please," she whimpered. "I was just scared. I wasn't thinking." I smiled. The same way she had smiled at me before she killed me. "Sure," I whispered. "Don't beg. You didn't let me beg last time." She froze. Her lips parted slightly, her pupils dilating. She understood now. She understood what I was. What I had become. The next morning, I called my parents into the living room. They came in tense, wary. I gestured to my sister, who was kneeling on the floor, her head down, her face pale. "She tried to kill me last night," I said softly. Gasps. My mother's eyes widened in horror. My father's fists clenched. And my sister? She didn't even try to deny it. She knew it was over. The next few hours were chaos. My father ordered the guards to take her away. My mother collapsed in tears, begging for forgiveness. But there was nothing to forgive, as I had already won. She was gone. Thrown out of the house, erased from our family, just like she had tried to do to me. And the best part? I didn't even have to kill her. She had destroyed herself. I stood by the window, watching as she was dragged out, her eyes empty, hopeless. Before they shoved her into the car, she turned to me one last time. Her lips trembled. "How?" I smiled. "Cold. Victorious." "This time," I whispered. "I was the one pulling the strings." The car door slammed. And she was gone. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching the scene unfold below me. My adopted sister, the girl who had stolen my life, my love, and my family in the past life, was being dragged out of the house, her screams of protest ringing through the halls. She begged. She cried. She even tried to turn it around, blaming me, claiming I set her up. But no one listened. Not my father. Not my mother. Not the guards who shoved her into the waiting car. Because this time I was the one pulling the strings. And she? She was finally powerless. I watched as she turned, her tear-streaked face desperate, her lips trembling. Her eyes met mine. No longer full of confidence and arrogance, but fear. For the first time she was afraid of me. "How?" she whispered. "How did you know?" I tilted my head, my voice soft. "Because, little sister." I stepped closer, watching her shrink back. I already lived this life once before. Her face drained of color. The door slammed shut. And just like that, she was gone. The silence in the mansion was deafening. My mother sat on the couch, her face buried in her hands. My father stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames, unable to comprehend how everything had fallen apart. But I had never felt lighter. The girl who had stolen everything from me was erased from our family. And now I was the only daughter left. I had taken back what was rightfully mine. But was that enough? I walked toward my father, my footsteps slow, deliberate. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you feel satisfied?" I smiled, the same way he used to smile at me when he looked down at me as nothing but an inconvenience. "No," I said. "Not yet." Because my revenge wasn't just about removing her. It was about making them regret everything. My mother's breath hitched. "You got what you wanted, didn't you? Why do you still look at us like that?" I leaned down, meeting her gaze. "You chose her," I whispered. "You let me suffer while she thrived." She shook her head frantically. "We were trying to give her a better life. At the cost of mine." My voice was sharp now, cutting through her excuses. Her mouth opened and closed, but she had no words. There was nothing left to say. I had one. The next morning I walked through the mansion, feeling its walls lighter, freer. The past no longer haunted me. I had rewritten it with my own hands. Everything that had been taken from me, I had taken it back. And now I was truly free. I stood by the balcony, overlooking the garden where my sister had once laughed, where she had once stolen everything from me. But now it was my turn. My turn to live. My turn to thrive. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, I was truly, completely alive. And no one would ever take that from me again. Revenge wasn't enough. I wanted my life back. And now, I finally have it.